a nice webinar archive over the years. Thank you again for taking the taking the time to show up. And I'm going to hand it off to Mike.
All right, thanks Hillary, and thanks everybody for coming. Nice to see you all. I see plenty of familiar faces and also happily some unfamiliar faces. So I'm Mike Paricio. I am the VP of the Maine Ento Society, and I am tonight's webinar host, and we have our speaker, Roger Rittmaster, with us. So special thanks to Roger for joining us and agreeing to present. He jumped right on board when I made the offer to him. So a little bit about Roger. He is a retired endocrinologist and an avid nature photographer, as you will learn throughout this presentation. He moved to Maine 10 years ago to pursue his hobbies, natural history, woodworking, and tennis. Shortly after moving to Maine, he authored the book Butterflies Up Close, a guide to butterfly photography. For those interested, that is available on Amazon. Feel free to pick that up. And then Roger is a Maine Master Naturalist, former chair of the Camden Conservation Commission, and serves on the board of the Coastal Mountains Land Trust. When asked about what areas of natural history interest him the most, he replies, anything that has DNA. So that's a little bit about Roger, and you can ask your own prying questions to him after we're done here. As we go through the webinar, Roger is open to taking questions as we go. We're going to do that in the chat box, so make sure you find the chat box. If you have questions, I'll be monitoring those and I'll interrupt Roger, but we won't be doing that verbally with so many people. So yeah, before Roger takes off, so yeah, everybody please make sure you mute, and you probably want to turn off your webcams as well to save bandwidth and avoid get caught doing anything you shouldn't be. So without further ado, Roger, the screen is yours. Take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, and let me share my screen and go to this talk. Get rid of all the people and go to screen. Okay, Hillary or Mike, does that look good to you?
Your full screen. Yep.
Okay, and I guess I can't get the bar off the top. Anyhow, so the title came from, I was trying to maximize participation in this, and I thought that if I put anything related to hunting in it, that we'll get a bigger audience. So that's why talking about shooting insects. So here's what I'm going to talk about. First of all, why photograph insects? So, you know, what are the different reasons? Talk about iNaturalist. If there's anybody here who doesn't know about iNaturalist and you like natural history, you need to know about it, and I'll give you an introduction to it. Then I'll discuss close-up photography of dead specimens, you know, collections, things like that, and how to take a good picture. Then photographing insects in nature, out in the wild. And if we have time, I'll talk about the art of insect photography. That's kind of a bonus thing depending on how quick this goes. Okay, first of all, why photograph insects? The first is, well, what is it? If you have a photograph, there's a good chance you'll be able to get it at least to genus, but often to species. If you want to document something like everything I see in my backyard, that's an excellent way to do it. And then finally, yes, having pretty pictures on the wall is a good reason. So we'll talk about iNaturalist to start with. What is it? Well, it's an online crowdsourced species identification tool. It's artificial intelligence, and it's based on the over 50 million photos that have been submitted and identified on this website. So when you post something to iNaturalist, there's a good chance, if it's at all common, that the app will be able to tell you what you've got. It's a repository of photographs by date, location, and photographer. So if you want to know everything that's been in your town or your county, it can tell you what's been seen there. It's a great educational tool, both for kids and adults. And one of the most important things, it's a way to connect amateurs like most of us with experts worldwide. And I'll show you an example of that. And then it's also a discussion forum for natural history for those who are
Hey, Roger, you're frozen.
Facebook for natural history. There are a lot of apps that will identify sleep to iNaturalist now. So this is a place to be. Okay, now my internet connection is unstable. I hope you can see this. I'm going to try. Yes, okay, so this is looking like it's going to work. Can you see, Hillary, can you see okay?
Are you, I think you gotta go, you're going to the website now, right?
Right, so you should be seeing a bunch of photos on it.
I just see the full screen of your PowerPoint still. So you might need to leave that full
Okay, so
screen.
I probably have to get that out of there. And let's go to now. Can you see it now?
Now I see your PowerPoint, not full
Okay,
screen.
so you're not seeing iNaturalist. Okay. So your screen sharing is paused. So I'm going to resume share. Okay. And now, can you see the iNaturalist?
Not yet. My suggestion is maybe stop sharing your
sharing.
screen and then reshare it with the
Okay.
iNaturalist kind of at the front of your screen.
Okay, so screen share. Okay, let's try this. Observations iNaturalist. How does that look?
Perfect.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so this is iNaturalist, and these are the observations that I put in. It's my own website on iNaturalist. It shows that I've submitted over 7,000 photos of over 4,000 species. What I wanted to show you is how to identify something. So there's this button up top that says drop some and drag and drop some photos or sounds. So I'm going to take a photo. It was on my desktop, and it's this little bee here. And I'm going to say, what's the species? And so, well, it's something living, but it can do better than that. So I'm Xing out and says species name. I'll hit that. And it says, we think this is in the genus Halictus, and we believe it's Halictus rubicundus. And that, in fact, is what it is. So it was able to identify this. And it's never adequate just to accept iNaturalist's identification, but it'll give you an idea of where to start. And it happens to be right here, but sometimes it's wrong. It just depends on how many photos it has of that particular insect. Okay, so I could upload this, but I'm not going to do that right now. What I want to show you is another example of why this is so powerful. So this is a photograph of a flatworm that I took in Ecuador one night. I was just going along the forest floor, and I said, okay, I can figure out that it's a planarian, and I put that in. And then I realized, well, I can go even further. It's a neotropical land planarian, okay. And then this guy, Lee Windsor, says it's the genus Pseudogeoplana because it has multiple haloed eyes along the margin. And I'm not going to go back to the photo, but I said, thanks. I must admit, I don't see the haloed eyes that are so readily visible. And he says, yes, the eyes are not nearly as conspicuous as in other species, but they are there. So who is this guy? Okay, well, this guy has studied land planarians for 47 years. He's probably the world's expert, and he's from Australia, expert on land planarians. And here I am in Camden, Maine, don't know squat about what I'm doing, and talking to one of the world's experts. And this is not uncommon. And I can say that on iNaturalist, I've never had a nasty comment. I've had multiple corrections in my diagnosis, but it's just a great place. So if you've never visited iNaturalist, it's worth doing so, and it's worth learning about it. That's all I'm going to say for now, because there's just so much, and I have a whole different talk on iNaturalist. And now I'll go back, and Hillary, is this good?
I still see your iNaturalist, so I'm thinking
That's-
maybe you should just.
Oh, now I got, okay, stop sharing and reshare and, okay, and we'll go back to the talk. And so now you should see the iNaturalist slide and the next slide.
Perfect.
Let's just see, it's not advancing, so. There we go. Okay, so now we're gonna move on and talk about how to photograph things that are on your desk. Usually a dead specimen. This one happens to be alive, the larva of a fish fly. So this is a camera, the Olympus TG6 camera, point and shoot camera that I got for underwater photography, because I also scuba dive. It is an amazing camera. It's $349. What I want to point out here is it has two lights. One is a flash and the other is an LED light. And that'll become important in the subsequent slides. What are the pros and cons of this particular camera? It focuses close to zero. I can get the focus down to 1 centimeter or less. It has focus stacking in the camera. So what is that? The camera takes multiple photos. You have to have the camera on a tripod. It takes multiple photos at different focus planes. And then it looks at what's in focus in each one of those photos and combines it into a single JPEG. So you have a JPEG with more in focus than you can ever get with a single exposure. And this is the only camera I know of that will actually do it in the camera itself. Usually you have to take the multiple photos and then import them on a computer into a focus stacking program. It also has, I mentioned that LED light. It has a diffuser that you can buy that will turn that LED light into a ring light. So you can place the camera as close as you want to the object, turn on that LED light, and it'll light up so the camera won't block the whatever light you're using. And it's waterproof and crash proof and all the other proofs. Cons, it's got a small sensor. It's a typical point and shoot camera. So it's not something you're going to blow up photos on your wall with. The lens I'd call average quality, not terrible, but it's not a superb Leica lens or whatever. And sort of multiple times I'd say, yeah, you need a PhD to get the most from the camera. It has a well-written owner's manual, but there's a lot there. Okay, so this is the camera. I now have it on my dissecting microscope, and I'm looking at this exuvia of a slaty skimmer that I have down at the bottom here, and I'm about to take a picture of it. Now, if you want to do it this way, the positives are you can actually photograph anything that's under your dissecting microscope if you have one. The negatives is it's more glass than is necessary between the sensor on the camera and whatever you're taking a photograph of. There's better ways of doing it. But if you want to do it, just one tip in the lower right here is as you're bringing the camera towards the eyepiece, find the beam of light that is coming from the microscope itself and just focus and move in on top of that to your camera sitting on the eyepiece. And usually that will focus at that place, at that point. Some cameras and some microscopes, the camera can't be right on the eyepiece. And then you have to have some kind of spacer in between the camera and the eyepiece. But what I want to tell you, after telling you all this, there's easier ways with this camera. So now we're going to talk about macro photography without a microscope. So one of the things that you should buy is this Pedco UltraPod tabletop tripod. It's $18.66 at B&H Photo. And it is just perfect because this is a lightweight camera. This is all you need for close-up photography. And well, I shouldn't say it's all you need, because the other thing you need is this piece of plastic that takes that LED light and turns it, uh-oh, my screen just went off. There we go. It turns it into a ring light. So that's 34 bucks. So I'd argue that that's a lot of money for a piece of plastic, but it's well worth it because of what it can do. So you can have the camera set up so that when you press the shutter button halfway down, the LED lights up just like this. So that becomes your primary light source. You have to be close, maybe 3 inches away, but then it's adequate light. And so here I'm taking a picture of that same exuvia with this setup, with the camera probably 3 inches off the top of the page and zooming in on it. But you can even do better than that. You can collapse the tripod and then have the camera sitting about 1 inch off the top. And here's a photo. Okay, I took the original photo focusing on the head of this exuvia, but then I turned on focus stacking, and now you can compare the two. They're identical pictures, but so you can see that even the paper it's lying on is in focus, where here everything is blurred. So this is a focus stacked image. It is really powerful, and now most of the photos I take are with focus stacking with this camera. And just to show you how incredible this happens to be a lichen that is on our walkway. And this is about, 1.5 inches. And each of these are apothecia, and there happens to be snowing lightly. So, and these are some snowflakes here. And then I set the camera on top of the lichen with that diffuser, the LED diffuser, and took this picture. So each of those apothecia are like right in the middle here. That's about 1 millimeter. This entire frame is about 1 centimeter. You could argue that it's not quite as crisp as you might like, but it's phenomenal in what it can do. And that's why I don't think at least a dissecting microscope is necessary. Okay, so that was photographing dead stuff. Hillary, this is a good time to stop if anybody happens to have any questions.
No
Or
questions yet in the chat, but I'll just
Okay.
say that those pictures are amazing. That's
All
amazing.
right. Yeah.
If anybody has questions, just toss them in the chat.
Okay. So now we'll talk about photographing live insects. And I've focused on butterflies for much of the last 10 years. So a lot of pictures will be of butterflies. Okay, so just some typical things approaching any insect. Start from a distance, gradually moving closer. Try not to touch any branches or anything that might shake the plant where the insect sits, because they're very good at detecting vibrations in general. Avoid casting a shadow over the insect. That's often the sign of a predator, and will take off or hide under the leaf. Avoid breathing. Carbon dioxide from your breath is another warning sign of a predator. And some insects, although they can't hear, can be spooked by the pre-flash. So, if you have a flash and it sends out a pre-flash. So there are especially some butterflies, like satyrs, will see the pre-flash, and then you take the picture and the butterfly's gone. And you say, oh God, why did that happen? Well, if you're using a flash, you'll have to put it on manual to avoid the pre-flash. Okay. So a lot of this is going to be quite beyond beginners. But again, you can go back and listen to the recording again if you have questions about what I'm talking about. You just didn't catch things quick enough. Okay, so this is about digital single lens reflex cameras, kind of the old style cameras, but now are digital. The strengths, they can shoot from the distance. You can use a telephoto macro lens that can just do amazing stuff. The sensors are generally large and very fast. So you can get pictures in low light or at very fast shutter speeds. On DSLRs, the focus is usually very fast and very accurate. Autofocus usually works great. There's a lot of different shooting options, and we'll go over some of them. And it has a fast recycling time, meaning that the delay between one picture and another is very short. In fact, often there are usually settings where you can take 7 or 8 photos per second if you want to take them bam, 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 bam. Limitations, the photographer must move to change the shooting angle. In other words, with point and shoot cameras that have an articulating LCD screen, I'll show you an example of that later. You can actually move the camera around and still be able to see what you're shooting. They're heavy, they're expensive, and the depth of field is narrow. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. However, I must say, if I'm going out to take photos primarily of insects, I use my DSLR camera rather than my Olympus point and shoot camera. So this shows you exactly the setup I use. And I'll go over each component of it just to give you some ideas. The camera, what you want is a reasonably high quality, compact, or full frame DSLR. So what's a compact? Well, it's one that has a smaller sensor, and I actually recommend that. They're usually about 50%, or maybe it's even a quarter of the size of the full frame sensor. But what it does is it multiplies the focal length of the lens you're using by 50% approximately. So here I have a 180 millimeter macro lens, but it's the equivalent of a 270 millimeter macro lens. So not only do you want a camera that is you don't have to get the top of the line, but is reasonably good quality, the camera must be able to talk to the flash, because you do need a flash in many circumstances to photograph insects. I'm trying to find there's my pointer. Okay, so this is a Nikon camera, a Nikon flash. They talk to each other, and I'll talk about how that happens. A telephoto macro lens is pretty important. Obviously, you can use a zoom lens, but the zoom requires more pieces of glass, and it's going to be less clear than if it's just a simple primary lens, in this case, a 100 millimeter lens, but that can get close as a macro lens. And then I mentioned the flash, designed to work with the camera, and I'll talk about how that happens. And then I did mention, when people came on early, that the lens hood for me is crucial, and the filter on front of the camera. I can't think of how many times I have fallen with my camera. So I'm paying more attention to what I'm trying to photograph than where my feet are going. So this helps protect the lens when I'm crashing down to the ground. Okay, so I went on the web to find out how much everything I have costs. I use a Nikon D7500. It's a reasonably new Nikon. It's about $1,000. It's the compact format. It's called DX in format. And the thing about this new camera compared to my 10-year-old camera is the sensor is so amazingly fast. And what does that mean? It requires very little light to take an image. And it is so good that you could almost get by without a flash just by increasing the sensitivity of the sensor. And we'll talk more about that. Now the lenses, telephoto macro lenses go from between about $600 to $1,400. 180 to 200 is ideal. 150 macro, serviceable. I couldn't find any new ones on the web. And what must have happened because of COVID-19, the Nikons, Canons, all that, Tamron, Sigma, they're all having trouble with production, and the demand's probably greater. You just cannot get a new one right now. But each of those companies do have good quality telephoto macro lens. I chose the Tamron, not because it's the easiest to use, but photographers who know more than I said it's an incredibly clear telephoto macro lens, and it's only $650 compared to the Nikon equivalent, which is about $1,400. And the flash I use is a mid-range Nikon flash. It's but it is able to talk to the camera, balancing light from the flash with ambient light that's striking the sensor. And in Nikon speak, it's TTL-BL, which means through the lens balanced lighting. And Canon has its own lingo for that. Okay, so just to talk a little about camera settings, a lot of it's about lighting, and there are 5 ways to control the amount of light. First of all, how much ambient light hits the subject. You say, well, it's whatever it is. But that's not actually true. There are times when, especially in the middle of the day, when the light from the sun is causing hot spots on whatever I'm trying to photograph. And if it's a subject that is not bothered by shadows, I will step between the sun and what I'm photographing to get it in the shadow. So you can control ambient light to some extent. ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor. And this is pretty amazing. For those of you who are probably 25 years old or older, you'll remember the old Kodachrome and Kodacolor cameras, film we used to use, and that was ISO 25 or ISO 40 or 50. I can't remember actually. Up to 400 if we're really pushing it. Well, ISOs today can go up to 25,000 or higher. And there is a problem with increasing the, you might say, well, why don't I just go up really high in the ISO? Because you can dial in what you want on the camera. The reason is the higher you go, the more noise there is. And in bright sunlight, it doesn't matter. You can go as high as you want, but the shadows will show this granularity or noise. Where at low ISO, say 100, 200, 400, you won't see that noise. Then you can control the f-stop, which is the lens, how wide open the lens is. We'll talk more about that. You can control the shutter speed, anywhere from a second to 1/4000th of a second. Now, obviously, that affects how much light the sensor sees. And the flash gives light. So all these can be balanced, and that's what makes digital photography somewhat of a challenge. I posted this website because I was doing research for this talk, came on this just amazing website, scantips.com. It was initially a guy who wanted to give advice on scanning photographs, but then he progressed to talk all about different aspects of photography, and it is just amazingly easy to understand and complete. And then in the end, say thank digital camera gods for LCD screens, because after you've taken the picture, you can get a good sense without even having to look at anything else. You just see what's in the LCD screen, whether your lighting is close to accurate or not. Okay, so what are the actual settings? Okay, so the first one I want to talk about is white balance. We haven't talked about that at all yet. White balance is the ability of the camera to see white as white. So if you're sitting now in a room indoors under incandescent lights, everything has a yellow cast to it. But if you see something white, you say, hey, that's white, even though it's really yellow, because your mind takes that into account. Well, the camera can also take that into account and correct for that yellow cast. Or if you're on a sunny day outside, but you're under a tree in the shade, everything will have a blue cast to it. So normally white balance I put on auto, because then the camera decides what is appropriate. Occasionally, if you're taking a picture, say of a red flower, it'll turn out purple. Well, what's happening is it's not adequately controlling for the shade, and then you'll have to change the white balance in the camera to shade, and then the red will appear red. Okay. ISO, we've talked about sensor sensitivity already, go from 200, even 100 up to above 25,000. I usually shoot at 400 to 800, except sometimes. And now increasing it up to 5,600 is no problem at all with my new camera. There's an auto ISO, and what that does is you set the aperture or the shutter speed, and it will determine the ISO necessary to adequately light that photograph. And it works pretty well with different modes, but it doesn't work great with a flash, because the flash sometimes is a conflict between which takes priority, changing the ISO or changing the power of the flash. And even different models of Nikons I know do it differently. It's worth experimenting with because it's kind of a neat concept. Then there's what mode you're shooting in. A beginner will usually shoot in the P mode or program mode, which basically says the camera decides everything. And it's amazing how well that works. But if there's adequate sunlight, I want to be able to say how wide open the lens is. And so I shoot on aperture priority or A mode. And what that does is I'll set the aperture of the lens and the camera will set the shutter speed according to what is necessary. Now, if there's inadequate sunlight, and that differs depending on what you're shooting with, I'll shoot with manual, and that means I determine the aperture, the shutter speed, and the camera will tell the flash, or the flash itself will say how much light from the flash is needed to adequately illuminate the subject. Okay. So next one is f-stop, which is the lens aperture. And cameras often go from f2 or f1.8 up to f22 or even higher. This is a product of the lens, and the bigger the lens, the lower that f number can go. Lenses that are quote slow have a minimum aperture that might be f4, for example. They just can't open up as much as a bigger lens. So the lens opening determines how much light gets in, but it also determines the depth of field. A low F number is wide open. A high F number is just a little pinhole of light. The smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. And conversely, the larger the aperture, which means the smaller the f-stop, it's a screwy way of saying it, but the f2 is larger than f22 in terms of the aperture. Then that's a very shallow depth of field, and I'll show some examples of that. So if you're in aperture priority, you're setting the f-stop, and the camera is determining the shutter speed. Now, having said this, in modern cameras, you can go into the menu and set limits on how fast or how slow that shutter speed is allowed to be. So now let's go to shutter priority, or S mode. Obviously, the faster the shutter speed, the less light will hit the sensor. If you're shooting at 1/250th of a second, you're going to get more light than if you're shooting at 1/4000th of a second. In fact, you'll get 16 times as much light. As a general rule of thumb, if you have a focal length of the lens, you don't want to shoot any slower than 1 over the focal length of the lens. And so if I'm having a 180 millimeter lens, which on a DX camera, small sensor camera, is effectively a 270 millimeter lens, it's hard to hold it steady enough if it's less than 1/300th of a second. And I usually try to shoot at 1/500th of a second or higher. That creates its own problem, and I'll get to that coming up. It's with a flash, there are certain things you have to do with that flash. And then finally, there's exposure compensation on your camera and on the flash. So there's a plus minus button or various ways of adjusting, but it says, okay, for everything I've set, I actually want the camera to have slightly more or slightly less light. And that's how you do it. In general, on the camera, the exposure compensation will take into account the exposure of the entire field or the center of the field. On the flash, it's meant to adjust just for the lighting and so just for the subject. And you can compensate on either the flash or the camera. Now, if you're still following me, you're a pretty experienced photographer, because again, you'd say, oh my God, this is so complicated. And it is. Okay, so the next thing is using a flash. There's TTL, which is through the lens metering. where the flash is looking at what strikes basically through the lens. And there's this, in Nikon speak, it's TTL balance lighting or TTL BL. And that's usually the default. Okay, so what TTL BL means is that the camera is interpreting how much light is available, and it's talking to the flash, and the flash is compensating for what the camera cannot deliver. Okay, and it's acting as a fill flash, just giving enough light to illuminate the foreground. Okay. In general, this is just something that I found empirically, but I usually underexpose by changing the flash output, that plus minus button on the flash, or however the flash works, by a third of a stop, or it's called an EV. I don't know what EV stands for, but it's basically a third of an f-stop in lighting. So, but if you don't do that, again, basically you might get a little overexposure. Now, if you're not using balanced lighting, you're using a third-party flash and it's not communicating with the camera, or the flash is off camera, then you have to decrease the flash output by about 1.7 EV, or stops. And that's because otherwise the camera will determine how much light is needed and will adjust itself, but the flash will also determine how much light, and you get twice as much light as you want. But basically you want to be photographing with a decent camera in TTL BL, or Canon has their own words for it, and Panasonic has their own words for that. One thing I just found out by preparing for this talk, you can meter off either a spot in the center or elsewhere on your object, or you can do center weighted metering. This is light metering, or you can meter on everything the camera is seeing. If in a Nikon you put it on spot metering, you can't do balanced lighting, and I don't know why that is, but I now use center weighted metering so I can make sure that it's in a TTL BL mode. Okay. Now, the next thing, and we're almost done with all this, so if this has gotten you bleary-eyed, we will go to stuff that's easier to understand in a moment. What is the sync speed of a flash? Mike or Hillary, can you see me?
Yes, you mean like your face?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to use my hands now. So the way a shutter works in a camera is one leaf comes down over the focus plane, over the opening, followed by another leaf. Okay, and the closer those leaves are together, the faster is the shutter speed. Okay, so the problem is those leaves can only, the second leaf that comes down can only come down so fast, and at the sync speed of the camera, that's the maximum speed at which the entire sensor is still exposed to light. If you go faster than that sync speed, the second leaf is coming down, and when that flash goes off, which is almost instantaneous, 1/10,000th of a second, part of the image will not be in focus, or not be lighted, if you're faster than the sync speed of the flash. And so in general, cameras will not allow a shutter speed faster than the sync speed of a flash, which is generally 1/200th of a second or 1/250th of a second. It's a product of both the flash and the camera. Okay, well, if I've already told you that we need to, with my setup, I'd like to be shooting at 1/500th of a second, I can't use a normal flash exposure. And so what do you need to do? Well, for high quality DSLRs, or even moderate quality ones, there's a setting called high speed sync. And what this does, instead of having an instantaneous flash, the flash now fires over the duration of the sync speed of the camera. So you get 10,000 little flashes of light. And then if you're shooting at, say, 1/4000th of a second, in that 1/4000th of a second, as that those two leaves are coming really close together, that flash is still firing at in that minimal opening and actually allowing it to be exposed. But if you're smart, you'll say, hey, that's okay, but that opening is so narrow, not much light can get in. And that's true. The faster you using the shutter, the lower the effective power of that flash is. So if you have a sync speed of 1/250th of a second, but you're shooting at 1/1000th of a second, essentially the maximum power of that flash is reduced by 1/4, which is 250 divided by 1,000. So it's 1/4. And the higher you go in sync speed, the higher you go in shutter speed, the less powerful will be your flash, or appear to be to the camera. Nevertheless, I shoot at high speed sync almost entirely because of what I'm shooting moving things or things that I need to focus on really quick, and I'm doing it handheld. Okay, and just one more thing is, most flashes come with a diffuser. If you're using a telephoto lens, you don't need that diffuser. The camera's far enough away, you just don't need it. Okay, so putting this all together, and I know this has been complicated, but let's say you want to stop something in motion like this monarch that's just taking off from this New England aster. First of all, you got to be lucky. But there's two ways of doing that. You can freeze the motion of the butterfly either with a shutter, by having a very fast shutter speed, or with the flash. So if you want to do it with a shutter, you set the camera on shutter priority. Say I want to shoot at 1/4000th of a second. You have to have high speed sync to do this. You do a high ISO, that's the sensitivity. You put it up to 1/16,000 or 16,000 or 25,000. So it's making it really sensitive because you're shooting so fast. And I can't read the other thing because I'm blocked off by the header. Let's see, oh, there we go. Yeah, you have it shutter priority mode, 1/4000th of a second, high speed. Now, if you want the flash to freeze, then you want a lower ISO, okay, because you want to limit how much light gets in. You put in whatever aperture you want, but you're in A mode, and you use the flash to freeze. So the idea is you set the aperture and ISO so it takes a lot of light to make the image, and therefore the background will be dark and won't contribute to the image, and everything will be dependent on the flash, which flashes at 1/10,000th of a second approximately, as long as you don't have the high speed, high shutter speed thing turned on. So that's two ways of freezing the insect. And for this one, I froze it using the shutter. But if I'd done the flash, the background would have been even darker, but it would have frozen the wings of the butterfly even more. Okay. Now it's not letting me advance. There we go. Okay, and just to show what f-stop is, so this is a shot at f/22, and you can see the Acadian hair streak and you can see some of the background, some of the other leaves. If I decided instead to shoot at f2, the background's blurred. And you might like this better or that better. There's no right or wrong, but it just shows you the power of controlling the aperture to get what you want. Most lenses have their best clarity around mid-range apertures of f8 to f11. So that's what I generally shoot at. But if I want to completely blur the background, I don't mind blurring the edge of the wing a bit because it's such a narrow depth of field, I'll shoot at a low f-stop. And this just shows me taking a picture, and I was looking at brown elfins here, and this shows a brown elfin ovipositing on the flower of a blueberry plant, its host plant. You can't see the egg, it hasn't quite come out yet, but when a butterfly oviposits, it curls its abdomen like that. Okay, this is another good time to stop for any questions you might have.
Okay, Roger. Yeah, we have a couple quick ones, and then I feel like there'll probably be some gear discussion after we're all said and done. So I'm not going to get into the gear stuff right now. First, quick question: can you comment on what's the average weight of a DSLR, maybe the camera individually, and a whole field setup? What you go out in the field
Never
with.
weighed it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was 6 pounds. If anybody knows, with a camera lens and flash, it definitely needs 2 hands. And if I go back to here, you can see I've got my elbows against my knees and body, and I'm really as hard and solid as I can make myself.
Okay. Another question about gear, not related to brands per se. What about a ring flash for a DSLR? Does that exist, and is that necessary?
Yes. Not necessary if you're shooting with a telephoto macro lens. You're far enough away that the single flash on the camera is adequate. You don't even need 2 flashes like some people use or I use underwater. 1 flash is good enough.
Okay. Question on composition. How much do you crop if you crop?
All right, I will. I'll be discussing that in a few minutes.
Okay, I figure that's probably a big part of it because a lot of these photos are from far away. Let's see, and then a question that was came in during the flash slide. Are these quote unquote curtains what's referred to as the sync speed, if I'm reading that right?
The sync speed is the fastest speed at which the 2 curtains, as the second curtain, will not impinge on the opening of the lens at that speed. So it's 1/250th of a second. That second curtain is far enough behind the first curtain that the entire camera's lens opening is still open. Any faster than that, the second curtain is too close to the first curtain, so the entire sensor is not seeing light at the same time.
Okay. We have a comment here. Somebody weighed their camera. They say 8 to 10 pounds.
Okay, I believe it.
Yeah.
I believe it. It's nothing to be taken lightly.
Okay, and then a question on photographing insects in real low light at night. Is it best to use a flash, or would shining a light on the subject work better?
Oh, well, usually, I mean, we're having lighting the area with a floodlight would be the best. A flash, you have to be able to see what you're photographing. So when I photograph stuff at night, I have a little light I use to highlight the image so the camera will focus.
Okay.
So I'm using an external light that I'm hand holding, or sometimes I've even taped it to my lens.
Very good. Okay, that's it for the simple questions for now. So if you got some more material, we'll go through the rest of that.
Yes, this will go much quicker. Smartphone photography, cameras have gotten a lot better, but they're limited. They're often the only camera you've got with you. So use them. Good for snapshots. Basically, it's point and shoot and pray. Small sensors, often the minimal focus is at 3 to 6 inches, so you can't really get in close. Macro lenses can be added to smartphones. I've had a 10x macro that I put on my iPhone, but it was too much. So I would say 4x, which is also available, is a better choice. Although the company that makes the best lenses, macro lenses, called Moment, I think only has a 10x. And it can't do focus stacking, not yet. I think that will be coming with smartphones. Okay, point and shoot cameras. I just went nuts looking through all these, and I realized these point and shoots change so quickly. This Sony is the highest rated. It's got a Zeiss lens. It's got a 1-inch sensor, which is a quite large sensor, and it costs about $1,400. compared to my one in the lower right, which is the $361 Olympus. But there's a lot available. And oh, the thing I didn't put down here, so if anyone wants to write it down, the best website for reviews is DP Review, digitalphotography.review.com, dpreview.com. And they're wonderful for recommendations. And of course, you can say, search in Google on what is the best point and shoot cameras for macro photography or whatever, nature photography. So I'm not going to go into each one. I don't use a point and shoot much, but if you're going to get one, here's some important things to think about. Key features. You want it optimized for macro photography, so focus is close. I would avoid super zoom lenses. Those are great for bird watchers. And if you're a bird watcher, you probably want a super zoom lens, but there's so much glass in them that the clarity is not as great. An articulating or tilting LCD screen. What it is, that's the viewfinder screen, flips up or over so you can take selfies and see what you're taking a picture of. But more importantly, it allows you to, the cameras are held at arm's length, and with an LCD screen that moves, you can change the orientation of the camera without having to move yourself. And that's a huge advantage. And I'd say the biggest advantage of point and shoot cameras. So I would look for one that has at least a tilting LCD screen, if not a fully articulating LCD screen. Size of sensors, 1-inch sensor is better than 1/2.3. Those are the two sizes. The 1/2.3, I don't even know what they stand for, but that's about a quarter of the size of the 1-inch sensor, which isn't 1 inch. Anyhow, the bigger sensors means a bigger camera, and usually adds several $100 to the price of the camera because other things are improved as well, including the quality of the lens. In the past, point and shoot cameras have been slow to focus, and there's been a long shutter delay. That's certainly improved now, but if you could find the information, you want something that's has rapid autofocus and a quick response time to the shutter. And I forgot to mention, now I just forgot what I was thinking about. Okay, well, the last thing is Bluetooth or GPS. If the camera has a GPS in it, it will say where you've taken the picture. If it's got Bluetooth, you can talk with a smartphone and use the smartphone's GPS to put the location in the metadata of the image. And the metadata is just the information around the image. So here I am using a point and shoot camera, and this articulating LCD screen is right here. And so I'm looking at that, and I'm holding the camera with one hand because they're light. And here's the flash, which happens to just be a tiny bit of flash that I put on manual. So it's a whole different way. You don't have to look through a viewfinder, you look at the LCD screen. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through photographic composition, the art of it, and talk about butterflies, and they're beautiful to start with, and all of these are cropped. I love taking pictures of butterflies with flowers, and it's obvious here's a pretty boring butterfly, a juvenile's dusky wing, and a beautiful picture in a zinnia. And when you're trying to photograph things, think about color. Here, not only do you have this cloudless sulfur, this is in North Carolina, and this flower, morning glory, they happen to be complementary colors. And what's a complementary color? Well, on the color wheel, there are two colors that are on opposite ends of the color wheel. Here, yellow and purple. And so that is very pleasing. That's why red and green for Christmas is so pleasing. Here I took a picture of a red banded hair streak on a Mexican sunflower, and it just happened that the color complemented the stripe in this butterfly. Okay, so this gets back to the question. Forget about frame filling images. The cameras are good enough now that you can stand back and you get enough pixels and take a picture like this and change it to this on your computer. So this is the front piece of a calendar I made in 2013 using, again, that image, cropping it and rotating it, and then putting in words. So I'd say stand back, your depth of field will be better. There's no need to get super close. You usually don't want your, this is all to do with art, not the actual technical part of the photograph. But you like the whatever insect to have enough room that is looking into the photograph still. It's not, the eyes are not right at the edge. And it's best to have the key points not dead center, but in a square defined by thirds, and I'll show that here. So this is called the rule of thirds, but it should be the guideline of thirds. These are the best spots. I'm poking with my finger right here to put the interest points of what you're looking at. And this can all be done by cropping. And then again, flowers can complement a butterfly and create balance. And the other thing I love is if you use curves and lines in a photograph. So here's one curve right here. There's another coming off this butterfly up this tube of the larkspur. There's these two lines here, which are coming over the top of the butterfly. It just enhances it. And again, this is cropped. And so I looked for what in the image I thought would look best. Look at that rule of thirds again. And said, okay, this is a neat picture. And here's another, just curves here coming in, and then curves here. Whoops, I don't know what I'm hitting to do that. Okay, backgrounds are best to be blurred if possible, using the f-stop at the lower f-stops. And thank you. So it's now 8:01, but I'm happy to stick on for any questions that people might have. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right. Thank you, Roger. That was wonderful. Yeah, I learned a lot. It was very technical, but wow, there's a lot going on. We do have one question that's popped up, and anybody else that has questions, get your questions in the chat box. How do you geotag pictures taken on your Nikon DSLR?
There's an app that is on my iPhone. It's Nikon something, and it allows the iPhone to communicate with the camera, and it geotags it.
Okay, great.
So the newer Nikon cameras all have, well, you need a camera that's Bluetooth enabled. Whatever maker has their own app for the smartphone.
Is that pretty standard on the modern DSLRs now?
Well, you need to make sure it's Bluetooth enabled. So